ABC General Hospital spoilers for the week of April 13 to 17 reveal that Ethan's return could not come at a more emotionally vulnerable time for the people around him, especially Christina. Poor Charles has always had a way of pulling old feelings back to the surface the moment someone believes they have finally learned how to manage them, and Ethan carries exactly that kind of disruptive energy. He is not simply a familiar face from another chapter. He is the kind of presence that awakens memory, longing, unfinished desire, and the dangerous temptation to imagine that the version of love once lost can somehow be restored in a new form. That is what makes his reappearance so meaningful. He will walk back into a town that has changed, but he will also walk back into the emotional blind spots of people who once attached dreams to him, especially Christina, whose heart seems to be caught between fantasy and emotional truth. Christina's situation is especially painful because her feelings are no longer simple. What she appears to feel for Jacinda is not merely attraction. It is admiration wrapped in hunger, loneliness wrapped in hope, and maybe even a quiet form of envy that she herself may not want to admit. At the Charlie's Pub reopening, the way she looked at Jacinda suggested more than passing curiosity. It suggested that Jacinda represents something Christina has been craving for far too long: emotional clarity, steadiness, and a relationship untouched by chaos. Yet, that longing may already be doomed, because what Christina sees when she looks at Jacinda may not be a real possibility for herself. She may be looking at a closed door and mistaking it for a future. The more she notices the bond between Jacinda and Michael, the harder it may become for her to keep feeding a fantasy that cannot survive reality. That is where Ethan becomes dramatically important. He could step into Christina's life at the precise moment when disillusionment begins to harden into emotional exhaustion. What makes that possibility so compelling is not simply the idea of romance, it is the emotional contrast. Jacinda may represent the kind of love Christina thinks she wants because it looks stable from the outside, but Ethan represents something far more intimate and dangerous: history, recognition, and the possibility of being truly seen. Christina has changed through pain, through loss, through humiliation, through repeated attempts to build herself back up after every emotional collapse. If Ethan notices that change, if he sees her not as the girl she once was, but as the woman she has struggled to become, then the emotional impact could be enormous. For Christina, that would not just feel like flirtation. It would feel like relief. It would feel like someone arriving at the exact moment her hope was beginning to sour into resignation. At the same time, Ethan's return may force Christina to confront a deeper truth about herself. She has spent so much time chasing intensity, misreading emotional sparks as destiny, and confusing longing with compatibility that she may now be standing on the edge of an overdue reckoning. What she truly wants may not be the thrill of wanting someone unavailable. It may be the safety of being wanted in return. That is why a possible shift from Jacinda to Ethan would not feel shallow if written with emotional honesty. It would feel like growth. It would mean Christina finally beginning to understand that love is not measured by how much pain she can survive for it, but by whether she can build something mutual, grounded, and real. Ethan, if he returns with more maturity and more emotional depth than before, could become the person who forces Christina to stop romanticizing emotional scarcity and start asking whether she deserves peace. While that emotional storyline quietly builds, the situation surrounding Jordan is drenched in fear, urgency, and the unbearable weight of almost losing something just as it seemed possible again. Jordan's crash is not just a medical crisis. It is a cruel interruption of a future that Curtis had barely allowed himself to imagine. There is something especially tragic about timing in stories like this. Curtis and Jordan were not standing at the beginning of an easy reunion filled with certainty. They were standing at the edge of something fragile. Something still trying to prove it could survive the damage already done. That is exactly why the accident hits with such force. It does not merely threaten Jordan's life. It threatens the fragile possibility of restoration, and that is what makes Curtis's fear so devastating. Curtis is the kind of man who knows how quickly life can steal what people assume will still be there tomorrow. That knowledge can make love more intense, but it can also make it desperate. As Jordan fights through the consequences of the crash, Curtis may begin to see with brutal clarity how foolish it would be to keep postponing what his heart already knows. If she survives, if she opens her eyes, if he is given one more chance, he may not care whether anyone thinks it is too soon. Near loss has a way of stripping away pride, caution, and timing. It can reduce a person to their truest need, Curtis may realize that he does not want another season of hesitation, another round of second-guessing, another long stretch of pretending that patience is strength. He may decide that the only honest response to nearly losing Jordan is to claim the future while it still exists. That is why the image of Curtis proposing to Jordan feels so emotionally powerful. It would not just be a romantic gesture. It would be an act of defiance against grief, fear, and regret. It would be Curtis refusing to let tragedy dictate the rest of their story. But that potential proposal would also carry deeper emotional tension, because it would not erase everything that brought them here. Curtis and Jordan are not a couple untouched by disappointment. They carry history, wounds, and the memory of everything that once pulled them apart. So if Curtis asks Jordan to marry him again, it will not be because love suddenly became simple. It will be because he finally understands that love does not become less real because it is complicated. In fact, sometimes it becomes more urgent precisely because two people know how hard it is to get back to each other after life has torn them apart. Jordan's own emotional position in that possible future could be just as compelling. Surviving something terrible often changes what a person is willing to accept and what they are no longer willing to delay. If she comes through this ordeal, Jordan may awaken into a world that suddenly looks different. Near-death experiences do not just frighten people, they clarify them. She may feel more vulnerable than ever, but also more honest. She may realize that strength is not found only in standing alone, but in allowing herself to want what once felt too dangerous to trust. That could make a reunion with Curtis feel less like a sentimental return to the past and more like a conscious, mature choice to stop wasting the time they still have. At the darker edge of Port Charles, Jocelyn's story carries a completely different kind of tension. Where Curtis and Jordan are being driven by love sharpened through possible loss, Jocelyn is being pulled toward danger by secrecy, surveillance, and the creeping collapse of her double life. Her visit to Ross Cullum in intensive care may soon become the mistake that keeps widening in her mind, because the problem with risky moves is not only what happens in the moment, it is what remains afterward: memory, evidence, suspicion. Jocelyn can walk away from that room, but she cannot control what Ross remembers, what details he pieces together, or how quickly a man like him might turn fear into investigation. That is the real threat hanging over her. If Ross confronts Jocelyn, the danger will not lie only in whether she can answer his questions. It will lie in what he sees when she tries to hide the truth. Men like Ross tend to notice tension, hesitation, and emotional inconsistency because they survive by reading weakness in other people. If he sensed something unusual about her visit before, then even the smallest sign of panic could sharpen his instincts. And once suspicion begins, it rarely stays contained. He could start digging into Jocelyn, retracing movements, questioning motives, and eventually uncovering the one truth that could destroy her safety completely: her WSB connection. If Ross learns that Jocelyn is tied to the WSB, then her life could change overnight. She would no longer be a young woman dabbling in dangerous territory or standing too close to someone else's war. She would become a target. That is an entirely different reality. A target is not allowed emotional mistakes. A target is hunted. A target is watched, manipulated, cornered, and forced into constant readiness. For Jocelyn, that kind of pressure could become psychologically brutal because she is still carrying the emotional instincts of someone who wants to protect the people she loves while also trying to prove she can handle the world she has entered. Those two instincts may soon collide. The stronger Ross becomes, the harder it may be for Jocelyn to keep her secret life sealed off from the people closest to her. What makes her storyline especially gripping is that the danger is not only external, it is internal. Jocelyn may begin to feel the strain of living in layers, and that strain can be just as deadly as any enemy. She may question every step she took, every risk she dismissed, every moment she believed she could control the outcome. Fear may begin to erode her judgment. Isolation may make her sharper in some moments and reckless in others. Once survival becomes the goal, people stop behaving like themselves. They become colder, more suspicious, more willing to lie to those who would try to save them. That could be the next stage of Jocelyn's descent. The threat from Ross may not only endanger her body, it may begin changing the way she thinks, the way she trusts, and the way she defines what she must sacrifice to stay alive. This is where the emotional architecture of the week becomes so strong. Ethan's return offers the possibility of emotional renewal, but only after disappointment. Jordan's crisis pushes Curtis toward a love that can no longer afford delay. Jocelyn's growing exposure threatens to turn courage into catastrophe. These are not separate beats that merely happen in the same week. They are variations on the same haunting question. What do people do when the life they wanted is suddenly hanging by a thread? Christina may discover that longing without reciprocity is a dead end. Curtis may realize that fear of loss is meaningless unless it leads to action. Jocelyn may learn that entering a dangerous world always costs more than the brave first step. Port Charles thrives when its emotional stories and danger plots mirror each other, and that is exactly what seems to be happening now. Love is not arriving as comfort, it is arriving as risk. Truth is not coming gently. It is threatening to explode through every fragile bond people are trying to preserve. Ethan's return may stir old feelings, but it may also expose how lonely Christina has become beneath her bravado. Jordan's fight for survival may awaken Curtis to the reality that second chances disappear if they are not seized. Ross Cullum's possible suspicions may push Jocelyn into the kind of survival mode that leaves permanent scars, even if she escapes physically unharmed. By the time this stretch of episodes reaches its emotional peak, each of these characters could be standing in a very different place than where they began. Christina may stop chasing what was never truly hers and open herself to something that can finally answer her heart. Curtis may stop treating love like a possibility and start defending it like a vow. Jocelyn may discover that survival in Port Charles is never only about outsmarting the enemy, but about deciding how much of herself she is willing to lose in the process. That is what gives this material real dramatic power. Beneath the romance, beneath the suspense, beneath the returns and confrontations, the week is really about people being pushed to the edge of emotional truth. And once that truth breaks through, nothing in Port Charles stays still for long. If Brooke Lynn really was driving drunk and played a role in the crash, the emotional fallout could be devastating for her in ways that go far beyond legal consequences. At first, the horror of the situation may not even fully register. In the darkness, in a moment clouded by panic, confusion, and alcohol, she could keep driving without truly understanding what happened behind her. That would make the truth even more terrifying, because Brooke Lynn would not just be living with guilt over a reckless decision. She would be living with the slow, crushing realization that while she was trying to outrun one bad choice, that choice may already have destroyed lives. Once news of the accident begins to spread through Port Charles, every detail could start closing in on her like a trap. A headline, a whispered conversation, a familiar name attached to the victims, or even one small clue about the time and place of the crash could be enough to make her blood run cold. That is when Brooke Lynn's emotional torment would truly begin. She is not someone without a conscience, so the possibility that she may have caused unbearable pain would hit her with enormous force. The guilt could become suffocating, not only because of what happened, but because of the terrible possibility that she left the scene without helping, without turning back, and without facing what her actions set in motion. At the same time, Brooke Lynn's fear would not be limited to shame or heartbreak. It would be deeply personal and brutally practical. If she confesses, she could lose everything she has been hoping for, especially her chance to adopt baby Phoebe. That dream could suddenly feel as fragile as glass. One arrest for drunk driving, one criminal charge, one scandal that paints her as unstable or irresponsible, and the future she has been fighting to build could collapse overnight. That is what makes her inner conflict so compelling. One side of her may believe she has a moral duty to come forward and accept responsibility. The other side may be desperate to protect the one good thing she still believes she can hold on to. This is where Brooke Lynn's story becomes truly tragic. She may be trapped between the woman she wants to be and the damage she may already have done. Every hour of silence could make the truth harder to confess, but every delay could also deepen her guilt. If the horrifying reality finally comes to light, Brooke Lynn may find herself facing not only public judgment, but the unbearable knowledge that one reckless night may cost her both her future and her sense of self.